For 3,000 years, the Galactic Council ruled the stars with absolute certainty. They had cataloged every species, mapped every system, and crushed every rebellion. The universe was theirs to command, and they knew every threat that could possibly exist. But legends? Legends were just stories parents told their children. Myths about a lost species called humans who supposedly vanished before the Council ever rose to power. Tales of beings so ruthless in war that entire star systems would surrender at the mere mention of their name. Stories of ships that could appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly, leaving only destruction in their wake. The Council's archives held exactly 7 references to these humans, fragments of ancient texts that most scholars dismissed as fiction. After all, if such a powerful species had ever existed, surely some trace of their civilization would remain. Surely the Council would have encountered them during their rise to galactic dominance. But on the day the unknown ships appeared at the edge of Zephyrian space, Admiral Thex, 9 of the Council fleet would learn the most terrifying truth in the galaxy. Some legends are just waiting for the right moment to remind the universe why they became legends in the first place. The humans hadn't vanished. They had been watching. They had been preparing. And now, they were coming home to a galaxy that had forgotten the price of underestimating Earth's children. The Deep Space Monitoring Station Vigilance Prime drifted silently through the void at the edge of Zephyrian territory, its massive sensor arrays constantly sweeping the darkness for any sign of unauthorized movement. For Lieutenant Commander Kex, 7, this assignment represented both punishment and opportunity. Punishment for questioning Admiral Thex 9's tactics during the Rigel suppression, and opportunity to prove himself worthy of a real command position. Keck had been stationed here for 8 standard months, watching empty space and filing reports that nobody read. The Zephyrian Empire controlled this sector with an iron fist, and the Galactic Council's backing meant that no rational species would dare challenge their authority. Pirates occasionally try to slip through the outer rim, but they were easily detected and eliminated by automated defense systems. The lieutenant commander was reviewing supply requisitions when his sensor operator, a young Zephyrian named Vel, 2, suddenly straightened at her console. Her scales shifted from their normal blue-green to a pale yellow that indicated confusion or concern. "Sir, I'm detecting unusual energy signatures on the outer perimeter," Vel reported, her voice carrying the precise tone that their species use for official communications. "The patterns don't match any known drive technologies in our databases." Kex moved to the sensor station, his own scales darkening slightly as he focused on the readings. The Zephyrian visual spectrum allowed them to see energy patterns that most species missed, making them excellent sensor operators. What he saw on the display made his internal temperature drop several degrees. 3 massive energy signatures were approaching from the direction of what the star charts labeled as Sector 847 Null, a region of space that supposedly contained only dead systems and cosmic debris. The objects were moving at a velocity that should have been impossible for ships of their apparent size, and their energy output suggested power cores that dwarfed anything in the Council's fleet. "Run a full spectrum analysis," Kex ordered, moving to the communication station, and sent a priority alert to Admiral Thex 9's flagship. "Tell him we have unknown contacts approaching Zephyrian space." As Vel's claws danced across her console, pulling up detailed sensor data, Kex activated the long-range communication array. Protocol demanded that any unidentified vessels be challenged before entering Council space. But something about these readings made his survival instincts scream warnings. "Unknown vessels. This is Zephyrian Defense Station Vigilance Prime." Kex transmitted on all standard frequencies. "You are approaching restricted space under the authority of the Galactic Council. State your identity and purpose, or you will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly." The response came not through their communication systems, but as a direct override of their main display screen. The image that appeared showed a figure that most Council species would have dismissed as impossible. A bipedal creature with pale skin, short dark hair, and eyes that seemed to hold the cold depth of space itself. "Greetings, children of the Council." The figure spoke in perfect galactic standard, though something in its tone suggested that it was not its native language. "My name is Admiral Sarah Chun, commanding officer of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. We are humans, and we are returning to the galaxy our ancestors once knew." Kex felt his breathing apparatus seize for a moment. Humans were legends, myths that some species used to frighten their young. Every educated being in the galaxy knew that no such species had ever existed, or if they had vanished long before the Council's formation. "That's impossible," Vel whispered, her scales now showing the deep purple that indicated genuine fear. "Humans are just stories. They're not real." The figure on the screen smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression that made both Zephyrians step backward involuntarily. "I understand your confusion. We have been absent from galactic affairs for quite some time. However, we've been monitoring the situation in what we still consider to be our territory, and we've decided that it's time to reclaim our place among the stars." Kex's training kicked in, overriding his shock. "I don't care what you claim to be. You're entering Council space without authorization. You have 1 standard hour to reverse course, or you will be engaged by our defense fleet." Admiral Chin's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to grow colder. "Lieutenant Commander Kex, 7, isn't it? I've read your file. Decorated officer, strong tactical sense, currently assigned to this monitoring station as punishment for showing independent thinking. A waste of talent, really." The casual mention of classified information sent eyes through Kex's circulatory system. How could these beings have access to Council personnel files, unless they had been intercepting communications for far longer than anyone realized? "How do you know that information?" Kex demanded, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "We know many things," Chen replied simply. "We know about the Rigel suppression, where you questioned orders to target civilian installations. We know about the forced relocations on Xeris Prime. We know about the tribute fleets that strip resources from developing worlds. We've been watching Kex 7, and what we've seen has disappointed us greatly." Vel's claws were trembling as she ran continuous scans on the approaching vessels. "Sir, their ships are generating energy readings that are off our scale, and they're not slowing down. They'll reach our perimeter in 37 minutes. Kex opened a direct channel to Admiral Thex 9's flagship, the mighty dreadnought Dominion's Edge. The Admiral's image appeared on a secondary screen, his reptilian features twisted in obvious irritation at being disturbed. "This better be important, Kex 7, Thex," 9 snarled, his own scale showing the aggressive red patterns that marked Zephyrian authority figures. "I'm in the middle of planning the Altair expansion. Sir, we have 3 unidentified vessels approaching our space. They claim to be humans, and they're refusing to acknowledge our authority." Admiral Thex 9's expression shifted from irritation to amusement. "Humans, what kind of pathetic scam is this? Every educated being knows humans are just legends that primitive cultures invented to explain natural phenomena. Blast them out of space for wasting our time. Sir, their technology appears to be significantly advanced. I recommend caution until we can properly assess. I don't care if they're flying ancient artifacts or the latest Andromedian prototypes," Thex 9 interrupted. "Nothing challenges Council authority in my sector. Deploy the 3rd Defense Squadron and eliminate these pretenders. Make an example that will discourage other glory seekers from wasting our time with fairy tales." The transmission ended, leaving Kex staring at a blank screen. His orders were clear, but every instinct told him that this situation was far more dangerous than Admiral Thex 9 realized. The energy readings alone suggested that these ships possessed technology that surpassed anything in the Council's arsenal. Admiral Chin's image was still on their main display, and she had obviously been monitoring their communications. "Your Admiral Thex 9 seems to be a being of limited imagination," she observed. "That's unfortunate. We had hoped for a more enlightened response to our return. You've been listening to our communications?" Kex asked, though he already knew the answer. among other things. Your encryption methods are surprisingly primitive for a civilization that considers itself the masters of the galaxy. We broke your codes approximately 3,000 years ago, but we've been polite enough not to abuse that advantage until now. Vel's sensor readings were becoming increasingly frantic. Sir, the 3rd Defense Squadron is launching from Station Gamma 7, but these human ships are moving faster than our interceptors, and their energy weapons are charging to levels that would require our entire battle group to match. Kex made a decision that would probably end his career, but might save his life. Admiral Chun, I'm going to speak off the record here. Our forces are mobilizing against you, but from what my sensors are showing, you have a significant technological advantage. Is there any way this can be resolved without bloodshed? Chen's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained alert. That depends entirely on whether your people are willing to listen to reason. We didn't come here to wage war, Lieutenant Commander. We came home to reclaim what is ours and to correct some very serious mistakes that have been made in our absence. What kind of mistakes? Kex found himself asking, though he suspected he already knew. The kind where advanced civilizations exploit and oppress younger species instead of protecting and guiding them, Chun replied. The kind where military might is used to extract tribute rather than maintain peace. The kind where entire star systems are stripped of resources to feed the ambitions of corrupt council members. Before Kex could respond, Vel called out in alarm. Sir, the defense squadron is engaging. Multiple weapons locks on the human vessels. On their tactical display, they watched as 15 of the council's most advanced warships opened fire with everything they had. Particle beams, plasma torpedoes, and gravitational disruptors filled the space around the 3 human ships with enough destructive energy to glass a planet. When the energy discharge is cleared, all 3 human vessels remained completely intact, their shields not even showing strain indicators. Impressive display, Admiral Chen commented, her tone almost conversational. Your weapons technology has certainly improved since we last observed it. However, I'm afraid it's still not quite adequate for the task at hand. What happened next would be talked about in military academies for centuries to come. The human ships didn't return fire with overwhelming force or demonstrate their technological superiority through destruction. Instead, each vessel simply extended what appeared to be tractor beam arrays and gently, almost delicately, disabled every single Council warship simultaneously. The 15 ships of the 3rd Defense Squadron found their engines, weapons, and life support systems shut down in a matter of seconds. They drifted helplessly in space, their crews alive but completely powerless. This is Admiral Chun to all Council vessels. The human commander broadcast on all frequencies. Your crews are unharmed, and your life support will remain active. However, your ships are now non-functional until we decide to release them. Consider this a demonstration of our peaceful intentions. We could have destroyed you, but we chose not to. Kex stared at the tactical display in disbelief. In less than 5 minutes, 3 unknown vessels had neutralized an entire Council defense squadron without causing a single casualty. It was a display of technological superiority so complete that it bordered on the impossible. Now then, Admiral Chun continued, her attention returning to the monitoring station. Lieutenant Commander Kex 7, I believe it's time for a more serious conversation. We have a great deal to discuss about the future of this galaxy, and I think you might be surprised by what we have to offer. As Kex watched the human ships approach their station, moving with the casual confidence of predators who had just proven their dominance, he realized that everything he thought he knew about the galaxy was about to change. The legends were real, the humans had returned, and the Council's 3,000-year reign was about to face its first genuine challenge. The question now was whether the galaxy's ruling powers would be wise enough to listen to what these legendary beings had to say, or whether they would force humanity to remind the universe why some species become legends in the first place. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened within hours of the incident at Vigilance Prime. though calling it an emergency session was somewhat misleading. Emergency implied urgency and concern, while what actually took place in the massive chambers of Council Central could better be described as a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and bureaucratic confusion. High Counselor Vex Prime, a towering insectoid being whose species had held the council leadership for over 8 centuries, stood before the assembled representatives with his 4 arms spread in a gesture of controlled frustration. His compound eyes reflected the chamber's lights in patterns that those familiar with Thek's anatomy recognized as extreme annoyance. Honored representatives, Vex Prime began, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made Thek's speech so effective for large audiences. We are here to address what can only be described as the most audacious fraud in galactic history. 3 vessels of unknown origin have attacked our forces while claiming to represent a mythical species that every educated being knows never existed. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, though several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The footage from Vigilance Prime had been transmitted to every major world within hours, and the casual ease with which the human ships had disabled an entire defense squadron was difficult to dismiss. Senator Cal, 9 from the Regellian Federation, raised one of her crystalline manipulator arms. High Counselor, with respect, the tactical analysis of this engagement suggests technology far beyond anything we've previously encountered. Perhaps we should consider the possibility that these beings are telling the truth about their identity. A wave of derisive clicks and chirps echoed from the more conservative representatives. Counselor Hex Alpha, whose species had built their reputation on military might, stood to address the chamber. Senator Cal, 9, surely you're not suggesting that we should take seriously the claims of some unknown species pretending to be mythological? Hex Alpha's vocal sacs inflated to emphasize his points. The very idea is absurd. These are clearly Andromedan separatists using some new stealth technology, or perhaps Voidwalker raiders with upgraded systems. As the debate continued in the council chambers, aboard the human flagship Indomitable, Admiral Sarachun was having a very different conversation. The ship's main briefing room was spartanly furnished by galactic standards, with simple metal tables and chairs that could be quickly reconfigured for different purposes. The walls displayed star charts showing council territory, and several officers were updating tactical assessments based on their recent encounter. "Ma'am, we're receiving communication requests from every major government in this sector," reported Commander James Torres, Chen's executive officer. His weathered face showed the kind of calm that came from decades of military service. "The Zephyrian Empire wants to negotiate. The Regellian Federation is requesting a formal meeting, and the Andromedan Collective is offering us territorial concessions if we'll consider an alliance." Chen nodded while reviewing the intelligence reports that her staff had compiled. "What about the council itself?" Radio silence so far, though we're monitoring their emergency session. "It appears that they're having difficulty accepting our existence." Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the expedition's chief xenobiologist, looked up from her analysis of the Council Species database. That's not entirely surprising. According to their historical records, humanity's departure from the galactic stage occurred so long ago that we've been relegated to the status of myth. Several species have incorporated us into their creation stories or use us as cautionary tales. "What kind of cautionary tales?" Chen asked, though she suspected she already knew. Harper consulted her notes. "The common themes involve humans as either destructive forces that consumed everything in their path, or as mysterious guardians who punish civilizations that grew too arrogant or oppressive. The Zephyrian Empire tells stories about humans who would appear to humble tyrants, while the Thex Republic has legends about human ghosts that haunt the dreams of corrupt leaders." Commander Torres chuckled grimly. "Well, they got that part right at least. We have been watching." Back at Vigilance Prime, Lieutenant Commander Kex, 7 found himself in the unprecedented position of hosting beings that shouldn't exist according to everything he'd been taught. The human delegation had arrived in a small shuttlecraft that moved with the same impossible grace as their larger vessels, and Their technology continued to demonstrate capabilities that defied conventional understanding. The humans themselves were proving to be even more unsettling than their ships. Admiral Chun had come aboard with 2 escorts, a tall man with graying hair who introduced himself as Colonel Marcus Webb, and a woman whose cybernetic enhancements suggested integration of organic and artificial systems that the Council scientists considered theoretical at best. "I apologize for the cramped conditions," Keck said as he led them through the station's narrow corridors. "Our facilities weren't designed for formal diplomatic meetings." "Actually, this reminds me quite a bit of home," Admiral Chen replied, running her hand along one of the bulkheads. "Your construction methods are remarkably similar to what our ancestors used when humanity first reached the stars. Practical, efficient, built to last." Colonel Webb was examining the station's internal systems with obvious professional interest. "Your defensive capabilities are impressive for a monitoring post. Those plasma conduits could probably handle main battleship power loads if necessary." The casual way the humans assessed their technology made Kex profoundly uncomfortable. They spoke as if evaluating the work of students rather than examining the cutting-edge achievements of galactic civilization. "Admiral Chun," Kex began carefully, "may I ask how long your people have been observing Council space?" "We never really left," Chun replied simply. "When humanity first encountered the species that would eventually form the Galactic Council, we realized that our presence was having a disruptive effect on natural galactic development. So we withdrew to the outer rim and established monitoring stations to keep track of how things progressed." The woman with cybernetic enhancements, who had been introduced as Lieutenant Colonel Alex Rivera, spoke for the first time. "What we found was initially quite encouraging. The early council showed real promise for creating a stable, peaceful galactic civilization." "Initially," Kex prompted. Chen's expression darkened slightly. "Over the centuries, we watched that promise slowly transform into something much less admirable. The Council became less about cooperation and more about control. Member species went from being partners to being subjects. Resource extraction replaced resource sharing. Military might replace diplomatic solutions." Colonel Webb activated a small holographic projector that displayed statistical data. "Our analysis shows that Council military actions have increased by 847% over the past millennium, while development aid to younger species has decreased by 62%. Tribute collection now represents 34% of the Council's total resource base." Keck stared at the data with growing unease. The numbers matched his own classified assessments, information that should have been impossible for outsiders to obtain. "How do you have access to internal Council statistics?" "We told you," Rivera replied with what might have been amusement. "We've been watching. Your communication encryption might keep other species from eavesdropping, but it's not particularly effective against technology that's had 3,000 years to develop specifically for monitoring purposes." The implications of that statement hit Kex like a physical blow. If the humans had been monitoring Council communications for millennia, they would know everything. Every secret military operation, every corrupt resource deal, every suppression of developing species that the Council had hidden from public knowledge. "Why reveal yourselves now?" Kex asked. "If you've been content to observe for so long, what changed?" Admiral Chun moved to the station's main viewport and gazed out at the stars. "We've been watching the trajectory of galactic civilization, hoping that the Council would eventually realize its mistakes and correct course. Unfortunately, recent events have convinced us that intervention is necessary." "What events specifically?" "The planned extermination of the Altair colony worlds," Chen replied quietly. "Admiral Thex 9's expansion plans call for the complete removal of the native population to make way for Zephyrian agricultural development. 12 billion sentient beings marked for elimination because they're not technologically advanced enough to resist." Kex felt his internal temperature drop again. The Altair expansion was classified at the highest levels, known only to senior Council officials and the military commanders responsible for implementation. If the humans knew about those plans, They knew far more about Council operations than anyone had suspected. That operation was deemed necessary for regional stability, Kex said weakly, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Colonel Webb turned from his examination of the sensor arrays. Lieutenant Commander, in your professional military opinion, is the extermination of 12 billion civilians necessary for any legitimate strategic goal? Kex found himself unable to answer. The truth was that the Altair operation had troubled him from the moment he'd learned about it, but questioning such decisions was not something that junior officers were expected to do. I thought so, Webb said gently. The Kex 7 that questioned orders during the Rigel suppression would never approve of genocide, regardless of the official justification. Admiral Chun returned her attention to the Zephyrian officer. We're not here to conquer or to punish, Lieutenant Commander. We're here to remind the galaxy what it means to protect those who cannot protect themselves. But we need allies who understand the difference between strength and oppression. Before Kex could respond, his communications officer announced an incoming priority transmission. Admiral Thex 9's image appeared on the main display, his scales showing the deep red patterns that indicated barely controlled fury. Kex 7, what is the status of those fraud ships? Have our reinforcements arrived? Sir, the situation is complex, Kex replied carefully. The vessels have demonstrated technological capabilities that exceed our current assessment parameters. I recommend immediate consultation with Council Command before taking further action. Thex 9's eyes focused on the human delegation, and his expression shifted to one of contemptuous amusement. So these are the pretenders claiming to be mythical humans. They look disappointingly ordinary for legendary beings. Admiral Chun stepped forward, and though she smiled politely, there was steel in her voice when she spoke. Admiral Thex 9, I presume. We've been looking forward to meeting you. Your reputation for decisive action is well known throughout this sector. I'm sure it is, Thex 9 replied, his tone dripping with arrogance. Just as I'm sure that whatever petty criminals you represent will surrender immediately when faced with the full might of the Council fleet. I'm deploying the entire 7th Battle Group to deal with your little demonstration. Chen's smile didn't waver. That's approximately 47 ships, if our intelligence is correct. Impressive. However, I should mention that we didn't come alone either. Computer, display current fleet positions. A holographic display activated in the center of the briefing room, showing tactical positions throughout the local stellar region. What it revealed sent shockwaves through both Kex and Admiral Thex 9. The region was filled with human ships, hundreds of them, positioned at strategic points throughout Council space, all previously undetected by the most advanced sensor networks in the galaxy. As you can see, Admiral Chen said conversationally, we've been preparing for this conversation for quite some time. These are just the vessels we're willing to reveal at the moment. I trust this clarifies the nature of our capabilities. Admiral Thex 9 stared at the display in obvious shock. The implications were staggering. If the humans could position entire fleets throughout Council space without detection, then everything the Council believed about its military superiority was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the strategic situation. This is impossible, Thex 9 whispered. Our sensor networks would have detected any fleet movement of this magnitude. Your sensor networks detect what we allow them to detect, Colonel Webb replied simply. We've had 3 millennia to perfect our stealth capabilities. More importantly, we've had 3 millennia to study your defensive patterns and tactical doctrines. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera activated another display showing detailed schematics of Council warships. We know the exact specifications of every vessel in your fleet, the training protocols of every crew, and the strategic thinking of every commander. We know because we've been watching and learning while you grew complacent. Admiral Thex 9 scales were now showing patterns that Kex had never seen before, a mixture of rage and fear that painted the Admiral's hide in swirling patterns of red and pale yellow. What do you want? He demanded. Admiral Chen's expression became serious, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of species memory and 3,000 years of careful observation. We want the galaxy to remember what it means to be civilized. We want the Council to return to its founding principles of cooperation and protection rather than exploitation and oppression. And we want to make it very clear that the age of unopposed tyranny has come to an end. Humanity has returned to the galaxy. Admiral Thex, 9. The question now is whether the Council will choose to work with us in building a better future, or whether it will force us to remind the universe why some legends become legends in the first place. As the transmission ended and Admiral Thex 9's image faded, Lieutenant Commander Kex 7 realized that he was witnessing the most significant moment in galactic history since the Council formation. The balance of power that had defined civilization for 3 millennia was about to shift dramatically, and the choices made in the coming days would determine whether that shift brought peace or war to the stars. The Council War Room was a monument to galactic military might, its walls lined with tactical displays showing the deployment of forces across 1,000 star systems. For 3,000 years, this chamber had been the nerve center from which the Council's military commanders had planned campaigns, suppressed rebellions, and maintained order throughout their territory. Now, for the first time in living memory, the beings gathered around its central holographic table were contemplating the possibility of facing an enemy that might actually pose a genuine threat. High Counselor Vex Prime stood at the head of the massive tactical display, his 4 arms gesturing at fleet positions while his compound eyes reflected the stress patterns that indicated deep concern. Around him, the most senior military commanders from every major Council species struggled to comprehend the strategic situation they now faced. Admiral Thex 9's preliminary report confirms our worst fears, Vex Prime announced, his harmonic voice carrying the subtle tremors that suggested barely controlled anxiety. The humans possess stealth technology that renders our entire sensor network essentially useless. They have managed to position significant forces throughout our territory without detection. General Crix Alpha, the massive reptilian commander of the Council's ground forces, slammed one clawed fist against the table. How is this possible? Our detection systems are the most advanced in galactic history. No species should be able to hide entire fleets from our sensors. According to the technical analysis, replied Admiral Vel Prime of the Council Naval Command, her crystalline features reflecting the colored lights of the tactical display, their stealth capabilities operate on principles we don't fully understand. Our sensors detect them only when they choose to be detected. Admiral Kex 7, whose aquatic species had designed many of the Council's most sophisticated electronic warfare systems, raised a tentacled appendage for attention. The communications intercepts are equally concerning. They demonstrate detailed knowledge of our operational plans, including classified information that should be accessible only to Council High Command. The room fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. If the humans had been monitoring Council communications for extended periods, they would know everything. Troop movements, resource allocations, planned operations, even the personal weaknesses and political maneuverings of individual commanders. How long? Vex Prime asked quietly. How long have they been watching us? Admiral Kex 7's skin pattern shifted to the pale blue that indicated uncertainty among his species. Based on the scope of their intelligence, possibly centuries, maybe longer. They referenced historical events and decisions that were made before any of us were in our current positions. General Crix Alpha scales began showing the aggressive red patterns that marked his species' equivalent of anger. Then, we've been compromised from the beginning. Every strategy, every tactical innovation, every new weapon system, they've been observing it all. While the Council's military leadership struggled with the realization that their strategic superiority might be largely illusory, aboard the human flagship Indomitable, Admiral Chun was reviewing intelligence reports from monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. The scope of the operation her species had mounted was staggering even by human standards, representing the culmination of 3 millennia of careful planning and technological development. Admiral, we're receiving preliminary responses from 17 different species governments, reported Commander Torres, looking up from a stack of communications transcripts. The reactions are varied, but generally fall into 3 categories: those who want to negotiate, those who want to surrender, and those who think we're still bluffing. Dr. Harper, who had been analyzing linguistic patterns in the various communications, added her observations. What's particularly interesting is how many of the younger species are expressing relief rather than fear. It seems that council rule has created significant resentment among the less powerful members. Chen nodded thoughtfully. The Human Intelligence Network had documented extensive evidence of council oppression over the centuries, but hearing confirmation from the victims themselves added weight to humanity's decision to intervene. What about the core council species? Chen asked. Commander Torres consulted his notes. Mixed reactions. The Zephyrians are mobilizing their full military, apparently convinced they can fight their way out of this situation. The Rigelian Federation is requesting formal diplomatic contact. The Thex Republic seems to be taking a wait-and-see approach. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera entered the briefing room carrying a secure datapad. Admiral, we've completed our analysis of Council military capabilities based on the engagement at Vigilance Prime and subsequent intelligence gathering. The results are sobering. Chun accepted the datapad and quickly reviewed the tactical assessment. What she read confirmed her worst expectations about how far galactic military technology had stagnated under Council dominance. Their weapons technology is actually regressing, Rivera continued. They've become so dependent on their numerical superiority and political dominance that they've stopped innovating. Most of their current ships couldn't match vessels that humanity was building 1,000 years ago. Dr. Harper looked up from her analysis with concern evident in her expression. That's not necessarily good news for us. If their technology is that primitive, it means any conflict could result in massive casualties on their side. We came here to protect galactic civilization, not to slaughter it. Chen understood the dilemma perfectly. Humanity had developed its overwhelming technological advantage not to dominate other species, but to ensure that they would never again need to watch helplessly as advanced civilizations oppressed those too weak to resist. The challenge now was finding a way to use that advantage constructively rather than destructively. Options. Chen asked her staff. Colonel Webb, who had been studying tactical projections, spoke first. We could demonstrate our capabilities through a series of limited engagements. Disable their fleets without destroying them. Prove that resistance is futile without causing massive loss of life. That might work with rational opponents, Rivera replied. But our psychological profile suggests that several council leaders are too proud or too frightened to accept defeat gracefully. They might choose to fight to the death rather than admit they've been wrong about everything. Dr. Harper offered a different perspective. What if we focus on the younger species first? Build a coalition of council members who are already dissatisfied with the current system? Present ourselves as liberators rather than conquerors. Before Chun could respond, the ship's communication system announced an incoming transmission from Council Central. The image that appeared on the main display showed High Counselor Vex Prime, his insectoid features carefully composed in what Chun recognized as a diplomatic expression. Admiral Chun, I am High Counselor Vex Prime, speaking for the Galactic Council. We request formal negotiations to discuss your concerns about galactic governance. Chen exchanged glances with her staff. The fact that the Council was willing to negotiate at all represented a significant shift from their initial dismissal of humanity's existence. High Counselor, I appreciate your willingness to discuss these matters reasonably. What format do you propose for these negotiations? Vex Prime's compound eyes reflected patterns that Chen's xenobiological training helped her interpret as cautious hope. We suggest a neutral meeting location where representatives of both sides can present their positions without military complications. I'm afraid that's not possible, Chen replied gently. You see, High Counselor, There are no neutral locations in this region of space. Your council's influence extends everywhere, which is precisely part of the problem we're here to address. Then, where do you propose we meet? Chun smiled, though there was steel beneath the expression. I propose that council representatives come aboard one of our vessels. You'll be perfectly safe, I assure you, and it will give you an opportunity to see firsthand the nature of the civilization you've been dismissing as mythological. The suggestion clearly caused considerable consternation among the council leadership visible in the background of the transmission. The idea of boarding an unknown alien vessel was probably terrifying to beings accustomed to dictating terms from positions of absolute power. That would be highly irregular, Vex Prime replied carefully. So is the return of a legendary species that's been watching your civilization for 3 millennia, Chin countered. I think we can afford to be flexible about protocol under the circumstances. As the council leadership huddled in urgent consultation, Chin received a priority communication from one of her monitoring stations. The message was brief, but significant. The council was mobilizing military forces throughout their territory, apparently preparing for the possibility that negotiations might fail. Admiral, Commander Torres said quietly, our deep space monitors are reporting massive fleet movements. The council is pulling ships from every sector and concentrating them at strategic choke points. It looks like they're preparing for war. Chin studied the tactical displays showing council fleet movements. The patterns were predictable, following strategies that humanity had observed and analyzed for centuries. What troubled her was the sheer scale of the mobilization. Millions of ships, billions of crew members, all preparing for a conflict that could devastate entire star systems. They still don't understand, she said quietly. They think this is about military conquest, not about fundamental changes to how galactic civilization operates. Dr. Harper approached the Admiral with a troubled expression. Sarah, I'm seeing concerning intelligence reports from our cultural monitoring stations. Several council species are beginning to panic. There are reports of civilian evacuations, resource hoarding, and social unrest. Our arrival is destabilizing the entire galactic political structure. Shin nodded grimly. This had always been the risk of revealing humanity's return. The shock to galactic civilization might cause more damage than the problems they were trying to solve. But the alternative, allowing the Council to continue its slide towards systematic oppression, was ultimately worse. High Counselor, Chen said, returning her attention to the communication with Council Central, I understand that our presence represents a significant disruption to the established order. However, I want to be very clear about our intentions. We're not here to conquer or to destroy. We're here to offer an alternative to the path your civilization is currently following. Vex Prime's patterns shifted to what Chen recognized as confusion. What alternative? The alternative of remembering what the Galactic Council was originally intended to be. A cooperative alliance of species working together for mutual benefit and protection. Not a hierarchical empire extracting resources from the weak to enrich the powerful. The council chamber fell silent as the implications of Chen's words sank in. She was essentially offering to help them return to their founding principles, but the challenge lay in whether they could overcome 3 millennia of accumulated power and privilege. And if we refuse? Vex Prime asked quietly. Chen's expression remained calm, but her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Then, we'll remind the galaxy why humanity became legendary in the first place. But I'd prefer that it didn't come to that. As the transmission ended, Admiral Chun turned to face her staff. The next few hours would determine whether 3,000 years of careful planning and technological development would be used to guide galactic civilization toward a better future, or whether humanity would be forced to demonstrate why some species were wise enough to withdraw from galactic affairs until they were truly needed. All ships maintain current positions, but prepare for immediate deployment, Chen ordered. It looks like we're going to find out just how much the galaxy has learned while we were away. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Regellian Federation was filled with representatives from over 200 species, all gathered for what historians would later call the most significant diplomatic gathering in galactic history. The crystal spires of Rigel Prime stretched toward the sky outside the massive viewport windows, their surfaces reflecting the light of three suns in patterns that had inspired artists across the galaxy for millennia. Senator Cal, 9, stood at the central podium, her crystalline form refracting the ambient light into subtle rainbows as she addressed the assembled delegates. As the Federation's senior diplomatic officer, she had spent the past 72 hours in continuous negotiations, tried to arrange a peaceful resolution to the crisis that humanity's return had created. Honored representatives, Cal, 9 began, her voice carrying the harmonic resonance that made Rigelian's speech so effective in large gatherings. We are here because the galaxy stands at a crossroads. The return of humanity forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of our civilization and our responsibilities to one another. The reaction from the assembled delegates was immediate and diverse. Representatives from Council Core worlds shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while those from younger or recently conquered species leaned forward with obvious interest. The political dynamics that had governed galactic affairs for 3 millennia were shifting in real time. Ambassador Hex, 9 from the Zephyrian Empire, rose to speak, his scales showing the aggressive red patterns that marked his species' displeasure. Senator Cal, 9, with respect to the Federation's efforts at mediation, we must not lose sight of the fact that these alleged humans have invaded Council space and threatened our rightful authority. This is not a diplomatic crisis. It is an act of war. Murmurs of agreement came from several of the core world representatives, but they were countered by voices from the Outer Rim territories. Representative Kex, 2 from the Altair colonies, stood up, her voice carrying the desperation of species facing extinction. Ambassador Hex, 9, your people have planned the complete extermination of my world's population to make room for agricultural expansion. Perhaps your definition of rightful authority differs from ours. The statement sent shock waves through the assembly. The Altair genocide had been classified at the highest levels, but the human intelligence revelations had made it impossible to deny. Several delegates began speaking at once, creating a chaos of voices that Senator Cal, 9, struggled to control. While the galaxy's political representatives debated humanity's return, the military situation was developing rapidly. Admiral Thex, 9, had assembled the largest fleet in Council history, over 3,000 vessels drawn from every major military force in the galaxy. The massive armada hung in space near the Centauri Nexus, the strategic choke point that controlled access to the galaxy's core systems. Aboard his flagship, the Super Dreadnought Dominion's Will, Admiral Thex, 9 studied tactical displays showing the positions of known human forces. The enemy ships remained scattered throughout the region, maintaining their positions with an apparent confidence that infuriated him. Status report. Thex, 9 demanded from his operations officer. Sir, we have confirmed positions on 47 human vessels, but our estimates suggest they have at least 10 times that number in reserve. Their stealth capabilities make accurate counts impossible. General Crix, 7, commanding the fleet's marine contingent, approached the command station with obvious concern. Admiral, our intelligence suggests that each human ship has firepower equivalent to an entire Council battle group. Even with our numerical advantage, a direct engagement could result in catastrophic losses. Thex 9's scales shifted to the deep red that indicated absolute determination. Then, we'll have to be smarter than they expect. They may have superior technology, but they've been away from galactic affairs for millennia. They don't understand modern military doctrine. What Admiral Thex, 9, didn't realize was that every word of his planning session was being monitored by human intelligence systems. Aboard the Indomitable, Admiral Chun watched the Council fleet's preparations with a mixture of professional respect and deep sadness. They're planning to use their civilian populations as shields, reported Lieutenant Colonel Rivera, reviewing the intercepted communications. Thex, 9, intends to position civilian transports within his battle formations, betting that we won't fire on non-combatants. Commander Torres looked up from his tactical analysis with disgust evident in his expression. He's right, isn't he? We can't target civilians, even if they're being used as human shields. Chen nodded grimly. The ethical constraints that made humanity's civilization worth preserving also created tactical limitations that less scrupulous opponents could exploit. It was a dilemma that our people had faced before, and one that had partly motivated their withdrawal from galactic affairs centuries ago. Dr. Harper, what's your assessment of civilian attitudes toward this confrontation? Chen asked. The xenobiologist consulted her latest cultural analysis reports. Mixed, but trending towards support for our position. Word about the Altair genocide has leaked throughout the galaxy, and many species are beginning to question whether the Council's protection is worth the cost. Chen made a decision that would reshape the tactical situation. Open a channel to Admiral Thex 9's flagship. The image of the Zephyrian commander appeared on the main display, his features twisted with the kind of arrogance that came from a lifetime of unchallenged authority. Behind him, the bridge of his super dreadnought bustled with activity as his crew prepared for battle. Admiral Chun, I presume, Thex 9 said with obvious contempt. Have you come to surrender before my forces demonstrate the futility of challenging Council authority? Actually, Admiral, I wanted to discuss your tactical preparations, Chen replied calmly. Specifically, your plan to use civilian vessels as shields during combat operations. Thex 9's expression shifted slightly, betraying surprise that his classified plans had been compromised. I don't know what you're talking about. Admiral, we've been monitoring your communications for the past 72 hours. We know about your tactical doctrine, your fleet dispositions, and your contingency plans. We also know that you've requisitioned civilian transports from 12 different worlds to serve as mobile shields for your capital ships. The truth was evident in Thex 9's reaction, though he tried to maintain his composure. Military necessity sometimes requires difficult decisions. Chen's voice remained level, but her eyes hardened. Using civilians as shields isn't military necessity, Admiral. It's cowardice. And it's exactly the kind of behavior that convinced us to end our withdrawal from galactic affairs. You understand nothing about the realities of governing a galactic civilization. Thex 9 snapped. Sometimes hard choices must be made to preserve order and stability. Is that what you told yourself when you planned the Altair genocide? Chen asked quietly. That murdering 12 billion civilians was a hard choice made for the greater good? The question hit its mark. Thex 9's scales briefly showed patterns of uncertainty before returning to their aggressive coloration. The Altair situation is a strategic necessity. Those systems are needed for agricultural development to feed the growing populations of core worlds. There are 17 uninhabited systems within 50 light-years of Altair that would serve the same purpose, Chen replied. The only difference is that those systems would require actual terraforming work instead of simply exterminating the current inhabitants. Dr. Harper stepped forward, her expression showing the kind of professional outrage that came from studying the systematic oppression of developing species. Admiral Thex 9, our cultural analysis indicates that the Altair colonies have actually developed sustainable agricultural techniques that could increase food production throughout the region. Exterminating them represents not just moral failure, but strategic stupidity. The accusation clearly stung, and Thex 9's response revealed the fundamental arrogance that characterized Council leadership. You speak of these primitives as if their opinions matter. They lack the technology to resist, which proves their inadequacy. Natural selection favors the strong. Chun exchanged glances with her staff, and they could all see the same thought reflected in each other's eyes. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had motivated humanity's return to galactic affairs. The Council had transformed from a protective alliance into a predatory empire that viewed weakness as a justification for exploitation. Admiral Thex 9, Chun said with deadly quiet, you've just demonstrated why this conversation was necessary. But since you seem to believe that might makes right, Perhaps it's time for a practical demonstration of the current balance of power. Before Thex 9 could respond, every human ship in the region simultaneously dropped their stealth systems. The tactical displays aboard Council vessels suddenly showed the true scope of humanity's presence. Not hundreds of ships, but thousands positioned throughout the entire galactic region with overwhelming strategic advantage. The effect on Council forces was immediate and devastating. Aboard the Dominion's Will, Admiral Thex 9 watched in disbelief as his sensors revealed that his supposedly impregnable formation was completely surrounded by human vessels that had been invisible moments before. Status report. Thex 9 demanded, though his voice carried none of its previous confidence. Sir, we're detecting approximately 4,000 human vessels in our immediate vicinity, his sensor operator reported with obvious panic. They've been there the entire time, completely undetected. General Crix 7 stared at the tactical display with professional horror. Admiral, every one of our ships is targeted by multiple enemy vessels. They could annihilate our entire fleet before we could return fire. The demonstration was even more dramatic in the broader galactic context. Human monitoring stations throughout Council space suddenly began broadcasting their locations and capabilities, revealing a surveillance network that spanned entire star systems. The scope of humanity's preparation for this moment became clear. They had been watching everything, recording everything, and preparing for every possible contingency. At the Regellian Assembly, the news of humanity's revealed presence created immediate chaos. Representatives who had been debating the theoretical implications of human technology were suddenly confronted with the reality that every Council world was under the direct observation of a superior civilization. Senator Cal 9 called for order as delegates from across the galaxy tried to process the strategic implications. Honored representatives, we must remain calm and focus on the opportunities that this situation presents. Ambassador Hex 9 was no longer showing aggressive coloration patterns. His scales had shifted to the pale yellow that indicated fear among his species. This is impossible. No civilization could maintain such extensive surveillance without being detected. Representative Vel 3 from the Outer Rim territories stood to address the assembly. Perhaps the question isn't how they avoided detection, but why they felt such surveillance was necessary. What have we done that convinced a legendary species to spend 3 millennia watching us in secret? The question hung in the air as the assembled delegates struggled with the realization that their entire civilization had been operating under observation by judges whose verdict was only now becoming clear. Aboard the Indomitable, Admiral Chun prepared for what she hoped would be the final phase of humanity's return to galactic affairs. The demonstration of their capabilities had achieved its intended effect. Every major power in the galaxy now understood that humanity's technological advantage was absolute, and their intelligence network was comprehensive. Admiral, we're receiving surrender requests from 47 Council military commanders, reported Commander Torres. It appears that Admiral Thex 9's fleet is experiencing significant morale problems. Shin nodded, though she took no satisfaction in the fear that humanity's revelation had created. Open a general channel to all Council forces and government representatives. When the transmission connected, Chun found herself addressing the largest audience in galactic history. Her words would be heard on every Council world, in every military vessel, and in every government building throughout civilized space. People of the galaxy, Chun began, her voice carrying the weight of 3 millennia of human observation and judgment. We are humanity, and we have returned not as conquerors, but as guardians. For too long, you have allowed fear and greed to corrupt the noble ideals upon which galactic civilization was founded. You have transformed cooperation into exploitation, protection into oppression, and strength into tyranny. The transmission reached across space to touch billions of lives, carrying with it the promise of change and the implicit threat of consequence. In the halls of power and the depths of space, the galaxy held its breath, and waited to learn what humanity's return would mean for the future of civilization among the stars. 6 months after humanity's dramatic return to galactic affairs, the landscape of interstellar civilization had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible just a year before. The Grand Council chambers on Central Prime, once the seat of absolute galactic authority, now hosted a very different kind of gathering. Admiral Sarah Chun stood before the assembled representatives of what was now called the Galactic Cooperative, her uniform bearing the insignia of humanity's new role as mediators and protectors rather than conquerors. The changes in the chamber itself reflected the broader transformation. The towering throne-like seats that had symbolized council dominance had been replaced with a circular arrangement that emphasized equality among member species. 6 months ago, Chin began, addressing the representatives who now came from over 400 species rather than the Council's original 57. Humanity returned to a galaxy that had forgotten the meaning of cooperation. Today, we gather to celebrate the first graduates of the new Galactic Defense Academy and to welcome 17 new species into our cooperative alliance. The reaction from the assembled delegates was markedly different from the tense, hierarchical atmosphere that had characterized council meetings. Representatives from species that had been suppressed for centuries sat alongside those from former council core worlds, working together on solutions to galactic challenges rather than competing for dominance. Senator Cal, 9, now serving as the cooperative's first elected coordinator, rose to present the Academy graduation report. The Defense Academy has successfully trained mixed crews from 43 different species in the principles of protective intervention and humanitarian assistance. These graduates represent the future of galactic security, defenders who serve all species rather than the interests of the powerful few. Among those graduates was Lieutenant Commander Kex, 7, whose decision to question orders during humanity's first contact had led to a complete reassessment of his career and principles. He now wore the uniform of the Cooperative Defense Force, having undergone intensive training in both human tactical doctrine and the ethical frameworks that guided humanitarian military intervention. The transformation had not been without its challenges. Admiral Thex, 9, and several other hardcore council loyalists had chosen exile rather than adaptation, taking their fleets to the outer rim where they attempted to establish new hierarchical empires. However, their efforts had been consistently thwarted by cooperative intervention forces that combined human technology with the diverse capabilities of hundreds of allied species. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, now serving as the cooperative's chief cultural advisor, had documented the remarkable speed with which younger species had embraced the new paradigm. What we're seeing is essentially a galactic renaissance, she reported to Chun during their monthly briefing. Species that were suppressed under council rule are experiencing explosive growth in technology, arts, and social development. The Altair colonies, which had been scheduled for extermination under council rule, have become a showcase for sustainable development techniques that were being adopted throughout the galaxy. Their agricultural innovations had indeed increased food production, while their social structures provided models for peaceful interspecies cooperation that had proven remarkably effective. Commander Torres, now overseeing the integration of council military assets into the Cooperative Defense Force, presented statistics that demonstrated the scope of the transformation. We've successfully converted approximately 60% of former council military personnel to cooperative service. More importantly, we've reduced military expenditures by 40% while improving security and response capabilities across all member territories. The secret had been humanity's 3,000-year technological advantage, which had made traditional military competition obsolete. Instead of multiple species maintaining separate fleets for defense against each other, the cooperative maintained a unified defense force equipped with human technology and trained in protective intervention tactics. Not all the changes have been smooth or universally accepted. The revelation that humanity had been monitoring galactic affairs for millennia had created significant resentment among some species, who viewed the surveillance as a violation of their sovereignty. Chun and Her staff had spent considerable effort addressing these concerns through transparency initiatives and the establishment of privacy protocols that balance security needs with individual rights. The monitoring was necessary to understand the scope of the problems we would need to address. Chun had explained to a gathering of concerned ambassadors. Now that we're working together openly, such extensive surveillance is no longer required. We're transitioning to cooperative intelligence, sharing rather than unilateral observation. The economic transformation had been equally dramatic. The Council's tribute system, which had drained resources from developing worlds to enrich the core systems, had been replaced with a cooperative development program that invested in infrastructure and education throughout the galaxy. Human manufacturing technology, which had advanced significantly during their 3-millennium withdrawal, could produce goods and materials at scales that made artificial scarcity obsolete. Perhaps most importantly, the return of humanity had restored hope to species that had been resigned to permanent subjugation. The cooperative's founding charter, drafted with input from hundreds of species, enshrined principles of protection for developing civilizations and prohibited the exploitation of technological advantages for economic or political gain. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera, who had become the cooperative's first director of ethics enforcement, reported on the implementation of these principles. We've established intervention protocols that prioritize the protection of vulnerable populations while respecting the autonomy of developing species. The goal is to create conditions where every species can develop according to its own nature and values, rather than being forced to conform to imposed standards. One of the most significant changes had been in humanity's own role within galactic civilization. Rather than assuming leadership positions, humans had deliberately taken advisory and support roles, sharing their technological advantages while encouraging other species to develop their own solutions to galactic challenges. We learned from our previous mistakes, Chen explained to a gathering of historians documenting the transition. When humanity first encountered galactic civilization, our presence was disruptive because we assumed we knew what was best for everyone. This time, we're offering capabilities and support while letting each species determine its own path forward. The success stories were numerous and inspiring. The Zephyrian Empire had voluntarily dissolved its hierarchical structure and transformed into a federal republic that better represented the diverse populations within its territory. The Rigelian Federation had become a center for scientific research and development, using human theoretical frameworks to make breakthrough advances in fields ranging from medicine to stellar engineering. Even former Council core worlds had found new purposes within the cooperative structure. Their accumulated knowledge and administrative expertise proved invaluable in managing the complex logistics of galactic governance, while their populations benefited from the increased economic opportunities that came with cooperative rather than exploitative relationships. Dr. Harper had been particularly impressed by the cultural renaissance that had followed the political transformation. We're seeing art, literature, and music from species that had been culturally suppressed for centuries. The diversity of creative expression is extraordinary, and much of it reflects themes of liberation, hope, and interspecies understanding. The military situation had stabilized more quickly than anyone had expected. The demonstration of humanity's overwhelming technological advantage had convinced most potential aggressors that conflict was futile, while the cooperative's protective policies had removed many of the motivations for interspecies warfare. When species don't need to compete for resources or fear exploitation by stronger neighbors, the incentives for military aggression disappear, explained Colonel Webb, who now directed the cooperative's conflict prevention programs. We're seeing a galaxy-wide reduction in military tensions for the first time in recorded history. As Chun concluded her address to the Cooperative Assembly, she reflected on how different this gathering was from the tense, fearful atmosphere that had characterized the Council's emergency session 6 months earlier. The representatives before her were engaged in collaborative problem-solving rather than political maneuvering, focused on building a better future rather than protecting narrow interests. The galaxy stands at the threshold of a new age, Chun told the assembly. Not because humanity has returned, but because all of us have chosen to embrace the principles of cooperation, protection, and mutual respect that make civilization truly civilized. The applause that followed was not the perfunctory acknowledgement typical of political gatherings, but genuine appreciation for the transformation that had been achieved through combined effort and shared commitment to common ideals. Later, as Chun stood in her quarters aboard the Indomitable, looking out at the stars that no longer held the threat of oppression and exploitation, she received a communication from Earth. The message was brief, but significant. Well done. Come home when you're ready. For the first time in over 3,000 years, humanity could return to Earth knowing that the galaxy they left behind would be in capable hands. The species they had once withdrawn from in order to avoid disrupting natural development had proven capable of embracing the responsibilities that came with technological advancement and galactic citizenship. The legends of human intervention had been replaced by the reality of human cooperation, and the galaxy was stronger for it. The age of might making right had ended, replaced by an era where strength was measured by the protection offered to the vulnerable rather than the power exercised over the weak. As the stars wheeled overhead, carrying the light of hope to hundreds of worlds and billions of beings, the galaxy moved forward into a future where the return of humanity had marked not the beginning of a new empire, but the birth of true galactic civilization. The humans had kept their promise. They had returned not as conquerors, but as guardians, and in doing so had helped the galaxy remember what it meant to reach for the stars with honor intact and conscience clear. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all, not the triumph of human technology or human wisdom, but the success of human values in inspiring the galaxy to become worthy of the infinite possibilities that awaited among the stars. The legends had become reality, and reality had exceeded even the most optimistic legends. Humanity had come home, and in coming home, had helped the entire galaxy find its way to a future bright with promise and rich with the potential of united purpose. The warships that had struck fear into the hearts of oppressors now stood guardian over worlds where children of dozens of species played together under alien suns, where the strong protected the weak not out of obligation, but out of understanding, and where the vast reaches of space held wonder rather than threat. This was the true victory of humanity's return, not conquest, but transformation, not dominance, but inspiration, not the end of one era, but the beginning of something far greater than any single species could have achieved alone.